Dr. David Cumin here with the Israel Institute of New Zealand, and we have a very special guest in Auckland today. John Medved has been named one of the most 50 influential Jews in the world by the Jerusalem Post. He's CEO of Our Crowd. John, you did a history degree at UC Berkeley. How did you go from history to startups to venture capital?
It's called a very old Jewish tradition, nepotism. My late father, Dr. David Medved, was a physicist, and he actually was a serial entrepreneur. And when I moved to Israel, he came to visit me, and at that point was working on a startup in the area of fiber optic communications. I accompanied him on a trip to meet with some Israeli scientists who spent a couple of hours talking to him about fiber optics while I was bored to tears. At the end of that meeting, the scientists turned to me and asked me what I was doing in Israel, and I told them I was doing some tour guiding and teaching of history and hanging out in the old city and having fun. And one of them turned to me and said, "Medved, a total waste." In Hebrew, he mentioned it, so my father wouldn't be embarrassed, or I wouldn't be embarrassed in front of my father. And I said, "What are you talking about? You're supposed to be dancing the hora with me and welcome me to Israel." And he says, "No, you don't get it. Guys like you, we've got a dime a dozen. Guys like your dad who are building fiber optic communications, that's what we need. That's Tzionut, or Zionism today." So on the way back from this meeting, I said, "Dad, will you explain to me what it is you do?" And I got sucked into the family business. I ultimately raised his first capital for this company, and together we built a company in fiber optics, sold it to Amoco, which is today British Petroleum, and I got my start. And next I built a software company, and then I became a venture capitalist, and the rest is history, as they say.
Fantastic. Well, you picked up on something. You said that the startup nation as it is now, back then it sounds like that was the beginnings of what Israel has become, and that was the new Zionism. What do you think the secret is of Israel's success in the startup?
Well, you know what, the secret of Israel's success is the secret of Jewish success in business and science. I mean, there's little surprise that Israel has turned out to be such a world power in business and in innovation, because the Jews are. You know, you look at the number of Jews who hold Nobel Prizes in the sciences, it's somewhere between 25 and 30% over the last 100 years. You look at the number of Jews who grace the lists of Forbes and others around the world. These are the only people who care about these lists are Jews or anti-Semites. They both read them quite assiduously, but we're also about 25 or 30%. Now, when you look at the Jewish percentage of the world's population, it being about 0.2% at best, this means we're about 100 times over indicated. That's, you know, or even larger, as the case may be. So that's the real secret. And the question is why? So why are the Jews? Is it DNA? Is it? And I think it's culture, and I think there's a long Jewish tradition of turning curses into blessings. You can go to the Bible and look at it, Bilam and Balak, where, you know, the prophet of the non-Jews was called to curse the Jews, and he ended up saying, "Ma tovu ohalecha," or "How goodly are those tents, O Jacob." And we say that every day and when we go to synagogue. But the curse, for example, of Israel not having water, okay, we don't have much water there, right, has resulted in the whole water industry, desal, drip irrigation, recycling. The curse of our kids going to the army, putting themselves in harm's way, has turned to be a huge blessing, because they are now leaders and they're people who work with incredible technology. And the IDF has been called Israel's largest institution of higher learning. The curse of no market, because we're so small, has turned into a blessing. Our companies go out and conquer world markets and really duke it out for global supremacy in their areas. The curse of existential risk, where people want us dead. It's not something new, it's something we've dealt with as Jews forever. That really affects our view of risk, which is the right view, which is life is risky. Okay, we're all going to die. So the issue is, what are you going to do while you live? Are you going to go out there and write a symphony? Are you going to try to create Nobel Prize winning science? Or are you going to go for a big company? And I think that's the secret. And that's the secret that has driven Jewish excellence. And that's the secret that drives Israeli prowess in the innovative area.
So necessity, in a way, is the mother of invention, as the saying goes. But how can New Zealand learn some of those lessons, and what do you see New Zealand benefiting from some of the Israeli successes? Is there anything?
Oh, sure, but first of all, every country has to take its own path, and its own path culturally, its own path in terms of development. I think the biggest lesson New Zealand can learn is you might be a small little country, but you can punch way above your weight class. And I know that New Zealand's active in a worldwide federation of small advanced economies. I think it includes countries like Denmark and Switzerland, Ireland and Singapore, Israel. I think we're going to soon graduate from this because we're going to hit the 10 million population figure pretty soon. Hard to believe, but true. But I think that's the first thing you can learn is that, you don't have to be a country of 50 million or 100 million to have a major impact. And Israel has proven that, I think, quite conclusively. I also think that you can learn from Israel that you can build a technology and innovation ecosystem from scratch. When I started back in the early 80s, there was none of this, right? There was some good science. There was some scientists developing missiles and talking to my dad. There wasn't a single venture capital fund when I started. Wow. And now 30 some odd years later, we're with over 100 funds. This year there'll be about $6.5 billion invested in Israeli venture-backed startups. To give you a comparison, for example, of another country nearby, Australia will have about 200 million. So Israel is out investing in absolute terms, and I'm sure this will be nice listening for your Kiwi listeners. You make points here by beating up on the Aussies, but I love the Aussies, and we have a lot of Aussie investors and backers.
Let's just not name the New Zealand numbers.
I don't know them.
Yeah.
But it's, this is not because there's anything wrong with Australia. It's because Israel has developed an extraordinary ecosystem, but the government did right things, right? The government built the incubator programs. The government built initial matching grants for venture funds. The government provided R&D credits. Now here, I understand that your country is doing similar things. In fact, some of it being inspired a little bit by what Israel has done in the innovation area. So the government is setting up incubators. The government's passing R&D credits. The government's trying to figure out how to lure venture funds. You have a geographic disadvantage. It's a schlep to get here, okay? It's really hard. But the world is shrinking. We now can talk to anybody and everybody via the internet. You have a lovely country. I mean, it might be a schlep, but it's worthwhile coming here.
It's beautiful.
And it is
well worthwhile.
It is well worthwhile. And my sense is that we can do a lot more between Israel and New Zealand. And I think that the future for New Zealand innovation is strong. And in fact, what we're doing at our crowd is essentially leveling the global playing field, both allowing investors from anywhere, hopefully from New Zealand, and we already have a lot of Aussies on board, investing in startups in Israel or in the US or around the world. And then we'd like to pour money into New Zealand startups. So today what I've been doing is meeting with angel investors, hearing about their companies, trying to identify what the next big company like a Xero to come out of New Zealand will be, because you can make real money on that. And we hope to do so.
So tell me a little bit more about our crowd and what makes it different to the traditional VC model.
So traditional VC is small. Traditional VC has always had sort of a boutique ideal where you've got $100 or $200 million, usually a couple of guys, not many women, unfortunately, in a room picking these winners and then making investments. That's not the way we operate. We have a global, rather large platform now approaching about $1 billion under management, where individual investors now for the first time can act like they were a big financial institution. They can get access to the best of class venture startups that they're investing alongside well-known international funds or figures like Bill Gates or Mark Cuban or Richard Branson. And what's cool is you can do this for $10,000, right? An investor, in Auckland or in Wellington or in Christchurch can literally pick a deal and say, well, I like autonomous driving, or I like drones, or I like precision agriculture, and I can invest $10,000 in a deal which Bill Gates is backing, or a deal which Sequoia, the famous US venture fund. And they get to look at all this material online. They're invited to webinars where they get to meet virtually. The management team actually asks them questions, interact. I hope at some point we'll be able to bring some of these management teams down here to New Zealand to pitch investors. So we're building a global community of investors. We have now 30,000 on our platform, over 1,000, by the way, in Australia, which is not too far from here. So if we schlep them down to Australia, which we do, we should be able to do a little bit of the mini add-on schlep. And what's cool about this is once you have that critical mass of investors, you can then actually start investing in that local region, because then you know who the bad actors are, who the schmucks are to stay away from, who are the good guys who really have promising companies. And I'll tell you, I met over Shabbat some really smart people here, people who are working with your rocket startups, people who are working on artificial intelligence and interesting companies of all kinds. And I'll bet you it won't be too long before we're making our first investment in New Zealand.
Well, that's very exciting. And I think there's a lot of potential in New Zealand, and hopefully we can tap into it and maybe bridge the Israel-New Zealand divide a little bit more than has already been. One of the things in the news, though, has been the Airbnb decision to withdraw some of their listings. How do you think that kind of shift in some of the perceptions around Israel and some of the things that might affect the business environment?
I think the Airbnb episode is sort of typical of our battles on the BDS, or boycott, divestment, and sanctions front, which is that as Jews, rightfully, we are hysterical about this stuff and very, very worried and want to combat it and fight it. The reality is it matters not at all in terms of Israel's long-term growth, and it simply doesn't count. Okay, now I feel bad for the few families who've now lost their livelihood, and we have to find ways to compensate them, and there should be a massive Jewish boycott, okay, as in buying, where we're staying in these houses in particular and showing that we can now, compensate for that loss. But just like the your Lord, cancellation and whatnot, it just doesn't matter. The only idiots like Roger Waters, are engaged in this BDS. If you look at what's happened to Israeli global trade since BDS was launched, it's gone through the roof. Okay, our numbers, whatever they're doing, they should keep on doing it because our numbers look great. And if you look at the way that the world relates to Israel today, they all want what we have. It's almost biblical. There are all of these large corporations pouring into Israel from all over, wanting to access our innovation. And I have been, in the last week, in Korea, in China, in Japan, and these are countries you'd think would be susceptible. They could care less. 3 weeks ago, I was in Dubai. They could care less. The people who care are nuts, okay? And this Airbnb thing, I have no idea where it came from. It doesn't matter. We're going quite nutso about it, as we probably should. But we have to realize the context. The context is I was sitting in my home with one of the largest, if not the largest, hedge fund manager in the world for dinner. And I had a Israeli member of Knesset, prominent one, sitting with us. And we're sitting and talking about Israeli business and Israeli culture. And finally, the Israeli member of Knesset couldn't hold back. And he says, Mr. Hedge Fund Manager, what do you think of BDS? And he goes, excuse me? He goes, the BDS, how is that affecting your trip here? He goes, what's BDS? He had no idea what those 3 letters stood for. And then, of course, the minister went on and on trying to explain it to him. And he was bored to tears. He goes, there's no boycott. No one I know cares about this stuff. And today, by the way, thank God there are laws in the US that will punish anybody. By the way, I think Airbnb is going to regret this hugely. Okay, it's not in their interest to have done this. And there are people who will, most probably take legal action against them. I don't know for sure, but I would guess. And my sense is that, you know what, there's a phrase in Hebrew, Aklavim nofchim v'hashayra overet. It means the dogs bark and the caravan moves on. And the caravan is moving on big time. Yeah. And occasionally there'll be some barking dogs.
So tell us about some of the people in the caravan, some of the companies that you've invested in. What are some of the successes of Our Crowd and the Israeli startup nation?
Well, I mean, right now, what's remarkable about our portfolio, or in general what's going on in Israel, is how broadly this innovation leadership is represented. There was a big piece just last week in the Financial Times about Israel's leadership in computer vision. And it was a whole page, okay? And, in England, we don't usually get that much good press, but this was a glowing report about how Israel, in just computer vision, running from Mobileye, which of course is in the area of collision avoidance and autonomous driving, we have today over 30 different startups doing the next generation of everything from big data to sensor fusion to remote control of autonomous cars if they get into trouble, to chips for these cars. That's a big area, about 500 different startups, and we have an investment in a very exciting mobility fund, so that's one area. Another area which is very big in Israel now is digital health. So everything having to do with mobility and mobile phones being used to create healthier lives for all of us. We have a company called Zebra Medical, which is the world leader in using artificial intelligence for radiological image analysis so that we can catch things that doctors miss. We have a company called CyberMDX, which is going to secure connected medical devices against hackers, because you really don't want a hacker to send you a ransom note that he's taken over your pacemaker or your insulin pump, God forbid. Yeah. You look at areas of precision agriculture. Israel's always had great agricultural talent, but when you combine it now with drones and big data, there are companies like Taranis who can essentially gather data in real time from your field through crop dusters. There's spectacular image stabilization technology where they can quickly fly, gather all this data, and then give you all kinds of advice and guidance to do yield enhancement. We have companies in the food area, a company called Silo, who are creating vacuum pumped they look like Tupperware, containers that will keep your food 5 times fresher, in your refrigerator. You look at companies just in the AI area alone, and we have a company called Sense Education, which is doing next generation testing for computer science classes so that you could actually have the computers check the scientists, okay, in terms of how they write the code, rather than teaching assistants that are used today in college classes. You look at cybersecurity, we have companies like ThetaRay who are securing banks and financial institutions against, quite dangerous attacks where they're stealing, tens of millions of dollars. ThetaRay's, on that case. And we can go on and on and on. I mean, the beauty of my job is that I'm able to not only hear all these incredible stories, but be an enabler and to provide funding, to act as a bridge between these great companies who are really changing the world and investors. I think the most exciting part of this is that many of these companies are what I would call impact companies, companies that are having a huge social impact. They're helping, wastage of food. Turns out that literally half the food that we produce doesn't reach somebody's mouth, okay, it gets wasted along the way. That's a big area we're working on. think about what we're doing in terms of health and fighting cancer or inclusion. We have a company called Up and Ride, who just 2 weeks ago enabled a groom who's a quadriplegic to stand up, okay, at his wedding.
That's an amazing video.
Okay, and you know, this, it doesn't get better than this. So you have the ability of investing in companies, making a return, a good return, and at the same time helping to solve problems of energy or inclusion or cancer or agriculture or food. And it's the fact that Israel is engaged in the next wave of tikkun olam. It's not just about making sure that our charities are well funded and that but we're on the case of solving truly serious global problems. And the Israeli entrepreneurs, I think, are really focused on how they can not just make money, but how they can do good at the same time.
And I think that's a wonderful way to end this interview, with such a positive note about what's coming out of Israel. And of course, you're in the middle of that and what seems like a fantastic job. And we hope to see more of you in New Zealand.
I hope so. And I would like to invite all of your viewers to join us at the upcoming Global Investor Summit we're having for our crowd in Jerusalem on March 7th. We'll expect about 15,000 people from over 100 countries coming. And if they want to see these companies in action, they want to meet these entrepreneurs, they want to feel this excitement, come to Jerusalem and join us. It's free, by the way. You got to cover your own airfare. Right. But once you get to the summit, it's on us.
Sounds great. Thank you very much for your time.
All the best.